I'm Stephen Monteith, and I'm here to recommend Star Wars. May the 4th be with you. Excuse me, may the Force be with you. Today is Star Wars Day, May the 4th, and I am going to rank all of the Star Wars movies. We have now 3 complete Star Wars trilogies, and we have 2 Star Wars anthology movies, and I think that's all we're getting for now. I don't believe any more are planned, or at least don't have any firm plans for them. No details about them for the moment. But we do have quite a library of live-action movies, and I am going to rank them all. I've been watching them in chronological order all weekend, and I was surprised, actually, at how these rankings came out. Now, I don't rank movies typically, but I have ranked a few franchises in the past. I've ranked the X-Men movies, the Spider-Man movies, the Batman movies. There are quite a few of each of those, and the criteria I use for ranking them, I just want to go over briefly how I do that, because it can be hard to get these kind of rankings, and they're so subjective. So many people have are so subjective when they're ranking these things, which I get. It's something I've noticed watching reviews, both positive and negative, of the Star Wars movies, is that the same elements in these movies that are praised by one reviewer are vilified by other reviewers. It's so wild hearing one person talk about, like, for example, this scene in Solo, a Star Wars story. There's a scene in there near the beginning where an Imperial recruitment video is playing in the background, and if you listen, you can hear that the music for the recruitment video is a heroic version of the Imperial March. You know, the dun 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 dun. The music that's supposed to make you afraid of the Empire when you hear it playing in a Star Wars movie. These guys are using a heroic version of that to recruit people into the Empire. And some people, like me, love it and think it's just one of the best things ever. And other people just hate it. Other people are like, oh my gosh, so you're saying that in the Star Wars universe, John Williams exists and works for the Empire? I get it. But seriously, it's a prime example of just how subjective watching Star Wars can be. The same things that some people love, other people are going to hate. Which is just one reason why I'm not usually comfortable doing this kind of thing. You know, not comfortable ranking movies. But I have come up with a bit of criteria that I think makes ranking them a little bit easier to get through. The first criteria is the movie's universe. You know, the special effects, the music, the costumes, everything that, you know, when you're looking at it, transports you into the universe of that movie. This is usually something that's more apparent in genre types of movies, sci-fi movies, you know, like the X-Men movies or like Star Wars. It puts you in that world, you know, the world that's so different than ours, the long time ago, the galaxy far, far away. But like I said, it's also comes down to the music. You know, John Williams' music is always great. And especially when it comes to Star Wars, I don't think you're ever going to find a Star Wars movie that that doesn't rank high in this area. All of the movies, even, the bad movies, have great costumes and great looking aliens and cool starships and special effects. So all the movies did fine in that area. The next one is the soul of the movie, the entertainment factor, the action, the humor, that sort of thing. All the movies did okay there too, at least. Most of them do really good, but some of them fall flat in a couple of areas. Attack of the Clones, the humor in that one is pretty bad, same as in The Last Jedi and Return of the Sith. Some of the action in these movies just isn't that great. It's not bad, nothing, it's hard to watch a Star Wars movie and not be entertained by it at some point. So none of them were actually bad in that area. So far all the Star Wars movies are doing pretty good. If you're just looking for a movie with pew 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 stuff and lightsaber battles and whatnot and cool aliens, then you're going to be doing okay with the Star Wars movies. You could pick any of them and it would be a good choice. Now we're going to get into some stuff that's not quite as subjective, some stuff that's going to be, that's going to really start to separate these movies into different tiers. There's the mind of the movie. How insightful is it? How much does it make you think? This one is where the prequels and the sequels start to suffer a bit. The original trilogy does pretty good. First of all, it's introducing us to a lot of things about the Force. Things that we don't really know as much about. George Lucas spent more time on that in the original trilogy, more on philosophy, more on how a Jedi uses the Force for knowledge and defense, never attack, and how, try not, do or do not, there is no try. He introduces concepts like that. He really makes us think about, what kind of people we are, and how are we approaching life and its challenges. So the original trilogy gets pretty much full marks for all of that, and he tries again with the prequels, but he throws in a lot of stuff about politics, and while I don't mind that, I've watched all 7 seasons of The West Wing, and I tend to rewatch that show a lot, so I don't mind politics in movies, even in sci-fi movies, but he doesn't do it very well. It's pretty bad, the politics in the prequel trilogy. There's a lot of just bad politics. Emperor Palpatine is supposed to be this chess master who is manipulating an entire galaxy and making it dance to his tune. And just because he's successful doesn't mean that some of the things that he does aren't, serious head scratchers. It's like, what the hell is going on here? You can't spend 3 whole movies just confusing the hell out of people. You know, you gotta make it smart, but you gotta make it accessible as well, especially when an audience is going in hoping for pew 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 stuff. And okay, so the next part is the emotional impact, the heart of the movie. Now, this is something that Star Wars, I felt, has always done pretty well. I mean, when I first watched the original trilogy, I was just a kid, but I was shocked by a lot of stuff. And it wasn't just because there were twists thrown in there, or these weren't just plot twists. These weren't just like a murder mystery whodunit type deal where it's like, oh, it was the butler all along, or he killed himself, blah blah blah. It's not that kind of twist. It's an emotional twist. It's something that changes the relationships between the characters themselves, and even if you know it all the time, the characters themselves obviously don't know it. Like you can go into the prequel movies, for example, and know that Anakin is going to become Darth Vader someday, but Obi-Wan, of course, doesn't know that. So when he's having this big lightsaber battle with him in episode 3, and it just rips his heart open to know that his friend, this person he's practically raised and trained and fought alongside, and is just betraying the whole galaxy. And it's really pretty powerful, actually. So I'm gonna be I'm definitely gonna be forgiving a lot of other crappy stuff that goes on. I mean, as far as trying to get emotional impact out of certain other scenes that fall flat, when something like that comes along, and you can feel the emotions of the characters on the screens, and in the movies, if you can have a moment that is that pure, like when, for example, Luke finds out that the man he thought killed his father is his father, when he finds out that his father's alive and in front of him, and he has to come to grips with something like that. A moment like that can lift an entire movie's emotional, quotient, basically. It can really change how you feel about the whole movie. But now we're gonna get into more technical stuff. The next few things are the plot, the writing and the dialogue, and of course the characters and the acting and how well they portray all this writing and all this dialogue, and how well they carry this plot. Because and those three are all interconnected, because it is the characters and the actors who who convey that story to us. It's rare to have a story come across at all in a movie without the actors being there to show it to us. So these next ones are where things like the sequel trilogy kind of struggle a bit. They do tell good stories. I feel like there's a lot of really good potential in the stories that the sequels tell, for example, and they do have good actors in there, but this gets down to the bones of it, really. It's just something that you gotta face, really. Disney didn't really have a fully outlined trilogy when they set out to make the sequels. The Force Awakens, The Last Jedi, The Rise of Skywalker. These weren't made with a plan in mind. You can say that neither was the original trilogy, but at least George Lucas made all those movies himself. Things that other people changed about it was more things like dialogue and character beats. It was still his overall story. Other people had input, but he still knew, generally at least, where it was all going. And if he needed to make a change, he made it. He had to sign off on it. So as much as the prequel trilogy and the original trilogy made changes as they went along, it was still a lot more cohesive than having a whole lot of stuff set up in The Force Awakens by J.J. Abrams and company, and then having Rian Johnson come along later and have to say, well, what am I supposed to do with all this? And then when Rian Johnson's movie falls flat in the eyes of some fans and critics, it's Disney coming along and saying, okay, now we're gonna have to change our plan. We're gonna have to course correct from this. And as I said in a previous podcast, they didn't really give themselves enough time to make the changes that they need. George Lucas always took at least 3 years between movie releases. Disney, it was 2 years at most between Force Awakens and Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker, and in between those, they were working on Rogue One and Solo, and so there was just a lot of resources devoted to those movies as well. So the stories definitely suffered because of that. Something you learn as a writer is you need to take the time that you need. You can't rush your story. You can't rush putting these things together. And you need to build the world. You need to know where your story is going. You can write by the seat of your pants, but every time you make a change that affects everything you've already written, you need to be able to go back and rewrite that stuff. You can't do that with movies that have already been put out there, because when you retcon the stuff that happens in the movie or movies that came before, people are going to be able to tell. People are going to know that, this wasn't always the plan. So, yeah, the sequel movies suffered a lot for that. Ironically, the movies that got overlooked a lot, like Rogue One and Solo, did not suffer so much for that. You know, their stories were, you know, self-contained. You know, even though they tied into other movies, and the main character for Solo shows up in a lot of other movies. They were still able to tell simpler, non-connected stories. They were able to take time on changes that they needed to make, and changes that they needed to make didn't mean that they had to, you know, scramble so much to line it up with what happens in other movies. You know, that's not to say that they didn't have troubled production. That's not to say that they didn't struggle to get those movies out there. But the simpler stories that they told were so much more straightforward, and that meant that any changes that they needed to make didn't necessarily make the overall film suffer for it. You know. So that's why those movies, even though they had the same kind of production problems that the sequel trilogy had, that's why Solo and Rogue One didn't suffer as much for it. Now the last two criteria are the guts of the movie. You know, the how much risk did it take? You know, what was the point of it? You know, and why did they, you know, what were they aiming for, and did they accomplish what they were aiming for? Now like I said, there was no real plan. You know, just a sort of vague outline for the sequel trilogy. So it's hard to say that the sequels accomplished what they were aiming for, since we know for a fact that they weren't always even aiming. You know, and that's not to say that they didn't take risks, though. I mean, it was a risk just to make a new trilogy. It was a risk, especially after the prequels, to say we're going to make something that is every bit as good as, you know, as what you're hoping it to be. We're going to try and please one of the infamously unpleasable fan bases out there, and we're going to make one movie a year. And it was just so ambitious, and perhaps they did bite off more than they could chew, but they did take some risks, and for the most part they hit what they were aiming for. But like I say, flying by the seat of your pants isn't always a risk that you're supposed to take. You know, you're not supposed to jump into a project this big without a plan. You know, that's not being brave so much as it is being reckless. Now the original trilogy was definitely a risk. I mean, there are so many things about it, especially back in the 70s and 80s, when these types of movies were just not even taken seriously. Nobody took George Lucas's original Star Wars movie seriously. He shopped it around to studios and directors, and people were all like this is nothing, you know. And he was just banking everything on it, and it paid off in a huge way. So he definitely gets full points for the risks that he took with the original Star Wars, and then he changes the formula up in Empire Strikes Back by letting the bad guys basically win in that movie, and then a little less risky with Return of the Jedi, because while it does show us new things, it's at this point he's wrapping things up, and he's saying, you know, this is the last one. It's not to say that he phoned anything in, but it was the conclusion basically, and and then he took a risk again when he brought back when he came back, you know, in the 90s, and said, I'm going to make the prequel trilogy, and I'm going to go to new places with it and showcase these new ideas and show you what the Jedi and the Sith looked like at the height of their power, because so far all we'd seen were a couple of really old Jedi masters at the end of their lives, and a young apprentice who hadn't fully become a Jedi yet, who was still in the midst of his training. We hadn't seen, you know, Jedi at the height of their power. And that was a story that he wanted to tell. And it was risky, and it didn't always pay off, but it was a good kind of risk. You know, it was the kind of risk that, you know, that we hope creators take with their work. And then there are movies like Solo and Rogue One that do sort of change up the formula a bit, because they're not, like I said, they're not connected to whole other trilogies, even though they do tie into the larger stories in their own ways. Not quite as risky, but still a little bit of a risk, because it does give us different types of Star Wars stories. You know, stories that aren't necessarily about Jedi or about the Skywalkers and the Emperor. You know, just stuff that's happening, you know, around the edges of these larger stories, you know. Anyway, that's kind of that should give you an idea of the criteria that I'm using to judge these movies. So now I'm going to tell you that that in the final analysis, there are not really any bad Star Wars movies. There are ones that are less quality than others, you know, that have like I said, a harder time hitting the mind and the heart in the ways that others do. And there are some that don't really take risks, don't really try anything new with the characters, and or with movies in general, that just really feel so generic and so phoned in. And like I said at the beginning, even when it does feel phoned in, though, these movies are still entertaining. They're still visually engaging, they're still, thrilling, and they've still got good action and some good humor at least. And they're all very quotable. As Star Wars is nothing if not quotable. You can so like I say, there are not any really bad ones, though there are a couple that are sort of on the border between good and bad. Now, those two movies are Attack of the Clones, Episode 2, the second of the prequel trilogy. That one, it sort of teeters on the edge of good and bad, because for all that the lightsaber duels and the fight scenes and some of the humor are good, and as much as it has interesting story and characters, the acting's pretty bad, and a lot of it just really falls flat. And the other one that's right on the edge of good and bad is The Rise of Skywalker. Not all of it was The Rise of Skywalker's fault. They couldn't... I make it sound like they just went into it writing blind. Perhaps I give it more grief than I should have, because as you probably know, Carrie Fisher, who played Princess Leia, she died tragically before they could make Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker. And in the broad strokes outline that they had, she was meant to be the focus of that movie. So that movie obviously needed to be revised heavily. It did need to have a different focus. But so maybe it doesn't deserve to be crapped on quite so much, but in the final analysis, it was still not as good as it could have been, So, yeah. That's the, so those are the two movies, Episode 2 and Episode 9, Attack of the Clones, Rise of Skywalker. Those are the ones that are right between good and bad. The next level, you've got sorta good. It's in the good tier, but it's not, something that you'll immediately say is good. It's something that you have to stop and think about whether or not it's good, and that's not always a good thing. That level is reserved for The Last Jedi. And that one, it did take some risks, with like Luke Skywalker, for example. And I think that ultimately they were not terrible risks. They were appropriate risks. And it did need to build off of The Force Awakens, some of the plot holes that, become apparent from that movie upon repeated viewings. So it wasn't always The Last Jedi's fault, but you do need... So I do say it's a good movie, but it's a good movie that you have to stop and think about whether or not it's good, and that's not always good. So that one is good-ish. It's in that tier by itself. The next ones are the good movies. Now, Episode 1 and Episode 3, The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith, from the prequel trilogy, these are good movies, but for different reasons. Episode 3 manages to tie up the prequel trilogy with the original trilogy. It manages to give us sort of an explanation for how things could go from the Jedi being at the height of their power and Palpatine just being a senator of some backwater planet to a universe where the Jedi are all but gone and Palpatine is suddenly the emperor of everything. It shows us how Anakin goes from being a young, sort of optimistic boy on a desert planet to being a more machine than man monster who needs to be redeemed. It really gives us, if imperfectly, it gives us a way to bridge that story gap, As for The Phantom Menace, why is that unequivocally a good movie? Because it's entertaining. Because for all the stupid stuff in it, it still has good actors giving good performances. Liam Neeson is my favorite part of the prequels. He's such a great Jedi and such a great character overall. And for all the crap that pod racing gets, it's... I genuinely like the pod racing scene. It's fun. It's whatever, And it shows us that even at, 8 or 9 years old, however old Anakin is, he's still, so naturally gifted in the Force that you can believe he would be, a dangerous villain someday when he grows up. Because he's somebody who can not only win a pod race that humans shouldn't even be able to do at any age because it's so fast and so dangerous, but he's just casually, going through these races while people are dying all around him. I mean, you'd think an 8-year-old kid would be traumatized by something like that, and perhaps he was. And perhaps that contributed to him being a Jedi. Or a Sith Lord. So that's a little bit of fridge brilliance there for you. And, of course, it has Duel of the Fates, one of the best lightsaber battles ever. Between Darth Maul and Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan. So all that stuff is great, and if it weren't for all the dumb stuff in it, it would be a great movie. But it balances out. So, The Phantom Menace and Revenge of the Sith are good movies, and the other movie that is in the good category is The Force Awakens. And for the same reasons. It's got good characters and, good entertaining action scenes and whatnot. But it's also pretty dumb in some ways. It has some pretty dumb moments in it. The Force Awakens does. And so that balances out. Plus, I'll never forgive it for, breaking up Han and Leia. Whatever you say about, whether that was appropriate or whatnot, I think it was a bad move. They never should have split Han and Leia up. Okay, right between good and great is Solo. Like I said, it's a simple story, but that isn't always a bad thing. And it's really, really entertaining. I don't know how many people have actually seen it at this point. You really should see it, though. A young Han Solo who has, all the nascent qualities that we see of him, meeting a young Lando and a not young Chewbacca, because Chewbacca is like 190 years old at the time of this movie. But Han Solo meeting Lando and Chewie and going on these heist type adventures and just being generally fun. It's such a fun movie to watch. It's funny as well. There's also There's also him piloting the Millennium Falcon for the first time. That's great. I love it. It's one of my favorite Star Wars movies. But it's not quite a great movie. Like I say, it's right between good and great. Now, the great movies are Rogue One, A New Hope, and Return of the Jedi. Those are all great, unequivocally. I love the characters that they introduce. I love the questions that they pose, and I love the action, and the special effects. They're all great. They're great movies to watch. And then there's the near perfect. I never say a movie's perfect. Every movie has something wrong with it. But there is one near perfect movie, and I don't think I'm going to get any arguments about this. Empire Strikes Back. So good. Such a great movie. Definitely the best of the Star Wars movies. Like I say, I don't think I'm going to get a lot of arguments about that. I don't think I even really need to explain it. But, if you don't believe it, that is why you fail. So that's my rankings of the Star Wars movies. The live-action ones, at least. Obviously, I didn't get into Clone Wars, the Clone Wars movie. But I don't think I think you'll all forgive me for leaving it off the list. Anyway, maybe someday we'll get more Star Wars movies, and I'll be able to rank those as well. But for now, it looks like it's just the series. Clone Wars, the Clone Wars series, Mandalorian. There's going to be a Kenobi series. Maybe I'll give over some podcast episodes to those in the future. But for now, I recommend watching the Star Wars saga, the movies, episodes 1 through 9, and Solo, and Rogue One. They're on a spectrum from sort of between good and bad to near perfect. They're not any ones that I would actually recommend that you never watch. They've all got something good about them at least. And that's why it's one of my favorite franchises of all time. Thank you for listening. I will talk to you later this week. May the Force be with you.